So here's the bad news. America is hurtling toward a nationwide electricity crisis that could crater our country's economic growth and undermine the middle-class American dream. The number of blackouts in America has risen by 13-fold in the last quarter century. The Texas blackouts in 2021 and the near collapse of the New York power system over the following Christmas Eve are but a prelude for what could happen next. So we've already heard from the gentleman before, so I'm not going to go into all of this, that pretty much everybody who's in charge of this system is saying that it is breaking down. We are losing about 83,000 megawatts of capacity while seeing demand return, thanks to the AI boom and some reshoring, to levels of demand growth in the power sector we have not seen since the 1960s. So, if we don't solve this, anybody's hopes of reshoring or reindustrialization aren't even going to get out of the crib. And even worse, it could send us into a downward spiral of seasonal blackouts. So how do we get out of this? I would submit that our first task is to change our perspective on the grid. For the most part, we take it for granted. The power comes out of the wall the same way that milk comes from the store. It's just there, right? And I've noticed that often when we on the right engage in critiques of green policy, there is a tick to adopt the premises of that which we are critiquing. I'm sure everyone has heard this line of argumentation. If you were a real environmentalist, so it goes, you'd love natural gas or nuclear power for lowering emissions. This is a perfect talking point to sandwich between advertisements for commemorative gold coins, of which there are only 100 left, so call this number now. And it's just not that the problem isn't only that this argument's opening play is to concede the ground of debate to our enemies, it's that it misapprehends what's going wrong. The current run of conservative complaints about green energy policy harbors an understandable and just urge to remove the boot of the administrative state from the energy sector's throat so that we can fully unleash our industrial powers. I'm deeply sympathetic to this and agree with almost all of it. But embedded within this urge is a fantasy wherein the government and governance thus disappear. It is a desire for a depoliticized grid, which has never historically happened anywhere, especially not here in the United States. It assumes that the grid will operate successfully only in a world without politics. Not only is this naive, I think, it disables us from solving our reliability crisis because we face today a crisis of our industrial commons. And a commons needs to be governed not just because we need it today, but because it is our patrimony. We have received it from our forefathers who brought it forth onto this earth through the calluses on their hands and the sweat in their faces. Our duty is to steward it so that we can pass it on to future generations, thus assuring their prosperity and, importantly, their social trust. When a commons fails, the tragedy is not only that the material consequences prove fatal, it's that such a failure bankrupts the fund of public trust and hastens decline by demoralizing the best of us while enabling our most mendacious leaders and our most corrosive social parasites. This trust, not climate and not the environment, should be our sacred concern. So what should this governance look like? I'm guessing we can all agree that we need to cut federal subsidies for wind and solar based on what we've just heard. I think that would be great, and if we can't do that, well then we should create reliability standards that are so strict that all of these projects soon become ineligible for any subsidies. We should also, as Arizona, I believe, has recently done, strip renewable energy portfolio standards out of the state because that's low-hanging fruit. And we need to roll back, especially the most recent new EPA regulations on gas and coal plants that could shut off half of our nation's power generation. But there is another solution that stands above the rest, that secures our industrial commons for posterity, and that is nuclear energy. It is the apex of power generation. Nuclear power will give us the firm bedrock upon which we can rebuild our industrial base. Nuclear power plants produce clean, reliable, and cheap electricity in abundance. Not only that, nuclear power plants can last for at least a century, perhaps even longer. To their host communities, they offer solid union jobs that allow families to thrive on a single income, which is in fact the only thing the Simpsons got right about Homer, is that he could actually afford for Marge to stay home and take care of the kids and buy a house for his family because he worked at Mr. Burns' plant. That's right, and blue hair. The other benefit is that nuclear power plants create a robust network of trade unions around them, steam fitters, welders, and so on, all dignified and important work. Every job around the plant can be passed from father to son, mother to daughter for successive generations, perhaps even forever if we can maintain these wonderful ships of Theseus. Nuclear power plants are industrial cathedrals, atomic Notre Dames, vital to building an industrial commons that can endure. So how do we unlock this technology that has been so maligned? Well, now it's time for a little bit of good news. I have a lot of problems with the ADVANCE Act that Biden just signed, but it passed unanimously in the Senate, which means that the environmental movement no longer has a firm grip on policymakers' relationship to the atom. That's a good sign morally, even if I don't like that bill. I'll get into that in a second. And the Biden administration, to my surprise, has, through the DOE, freed up $9 billion in federal money for new nuclear projects. I am sure everyone at the Sierra Club filled their drawers as soon as they got that news, which we should cheer on, at least that happening to people who work at the Sierra Club. America is now, after many decades, a pro-nuclear country, as we should be because we have the largest nuclear fleet in the world. So here's some more good news. While we have this federal mandate and an appetite for money that I believe is necessary to building out the nuclear fleet, there is no real vision for execution. It's all just kind of sitting there, hoping that something happens. That's where we come in if we can choose to govern. So here's my proposal for pulling off a massive expansion of our fleet of industrial cathedrals. First, we need a single reactor type because nuclear benefits from economies of repetition, not innovation. And lucky for us, we have a best-in-class reactor with its supply chain and workforce recently established. That's Westinghouse's AP1000, which has just finally been finished in Georgia. I should add, the ADVANCE Act excludes the AP1000 or any reactor like it from any of its money. It's a handout to the SMRs, none of which exist, by the way, and maybe never will. Second, we need to fill the empty reactor spots left at all of the nuclear plants that have them. Most of the nuclear plants in America were designed to house 4 reactors, and many of them only have 1 or 2. This means we can work with utilities in Westinghouse to drive support to adding reactors to existing plants, outflanking the environmental movement's typical lawfare over new project siting. Lastly, we have an aging coal fleet that needs replacement. Some of those we're going to want to keep, by the way. But for the ones that are aging out, we need to replace their capacity on the grid, but even more importantly, I would say, to replace those coal jobs. Perhaps some people here have seen what happens when their hometown shuts down its plant. It becomes a haven for opioids, a hothouse for human tragedy. We can offer these communities nuclear reactors built at the coal site and retrain the workforce to operate those reactors. We know this is achievable because that's how Ontario replaced its coal fleet, and I'll be goddamned if those Maple Leaf guys do something better than us. I call this little scheme, by the way, nuclear or Narcan, because those are the stakes for these communities, which sit in mostly red districts, I might add. Our future rides on America's industrial commons, our power grid, the mother network that links together our entire society and powers nearly every aspect of our lives. For this, we need a new policy vision, one that anchors us in the past, guides us through our present, and opens into our future. The industrial cathedral is the lodestar of this vision. Picture the Frederick Douglass nuclear power plant, the Mark Twain Mississippi reactor corridor, the Theodore Roosevelt reactor park. Picture, if you will, an America that has had nuclear power for longer than it has not. a republic of industrial cathedrals, of the people, by the people, and for the people, forever. Thank you.